Okay, there we go. We'd like to get started, so if you could take your seats, that would be great. I'm Rob Gordon with the Heritage Foundation. I'm a senior fellow here. And when I was asked to address this, moderate this panel, I jumped at the chance because I know they saved the best for last. As Brooke said, we have an awesome panel. Before we get going, I'd just like to give my own little shout out to Kathleen White, who, as Brooke mentioned, is the nominee to head CEQ, which I think is a great thing. And although she couldn't be here with us today, I hope she's watching. The Industry and Economy panel is going to be a very exciting one. For me, I look at these issues from an environmental perspective. And I think energy is often confused by folks with fuel. And I found a better way to maybe think about it is the classic physics definition of the capacity to do work. Make everything we need or want. So this is the panel that addresses that. But if we want more of something, not less, we need energy to be affordable and reliable. And we know that in those societies that use more energy, they tend to have more vigorous growing economies, greater economic growth. We also know that in societies where there is greater economic growth, larger GDPs, greater per capita income, there are generally longer lifespans. And when the topic of industry and the economy are discussed from an environmental perspective, every possible environmental impact, real, and often those that are actually exaggerated or imaginary, are raised. I would argue that the most important environmental metric is human well-being, because people are most important. And with that in mind, creation and use of energy for industry and the economy is fundamentally a good thing. And we have a great panel to address this, and I'll give you a brief sketch on each, but it won't do justice to all their good works. That's why there's a longer bio in the program. First, we'll hear from Rupert Darwal, who's a strategy consultant and policy analyst and has written extensively for publications on both sides of the pond, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Daily Telegraph, The Spectator, and is the author of the widely praised The Age of Global Warming, A History of the Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate-Industrial Complex. Rupert previously worked as an investment analyst and in corporate finance before becoming a special advisor to then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, and he studied economics and history at Cambridge University. Then we'll hear from Lou Pugliaresi, president of the Energy Policy Research Foundation, a public policy think tank founded in 1944. Lou has served in a wide range of government posts, including the National Security Council in the White House during the Reagan administration, Departments of State, Energy, and Interior, as well as the EPA. He's written extensively on energy and frequently testifies before various committees of Congress. And he's published extensively on petroleum topics and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal. And then we will hear from Mark Mills. Mark's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a faculty fellow at the McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science at Northwestern University. He also serves on the advisory board, Notre Dame Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values, and is a strategic partner at Cotton Venture Partners. He writes the Energy Intelligence column for Forbes and is co-author of just an absolutely splendid book, The Bottomless Well, which rose to first place in Amazon's science ranking and about which Bill Gates said, "This is the only book I've ever seen that really explains energy." And I agree with that comment. Mark was a staff consultant in the White House Science Office under President Reagan, and earlier in his career was an experimental physicist and development engineer in microprocessors, fiber optics, and optical detectors at Canada's Bell Labs and RCA's Sarnoff Research Center. And finally, I hope I haven't lost you, Kevin. We'll hear from my colleague, Kevin Diaratna, who specializes in tax, energy, and health policy issues as a senior statistician and research programmer in the Heritage's Foundation's Center for Data Analysis. Kevin instituted the Heritage Energy Model derived from the Energy Information Administration's National Energy Modeling System to quantify and help policymakers understand the long-term economic effects of energy policy proposals. Kevin studied applied mathematics with a concentration in mathematical physics at the University of California at Berkeley. He holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Maryland, one in management and the other in mathematical statistics. He has a PhD in mathematical statistics from the University of Maryland. First off, we're going to hear from Rupert, who leaves no stone unturned in his research regarding the origin of our dystopian energy policies. Rupert.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Warriors for Truth and Freedom. I'd like to use my slot to explain how we got here and why we're here today. If the policy response to global warming was adaptation, we wouldn't be here today. Societies in the past have adapted to climate change without being told what to do. And the industrialized societies of today are more capable of adapting to climate change than any other in human history. If the favoured policy response was more nuclear power, I still don't think we'd be here today. But governments around the world are forcibly replacing the hydrocarbon-powered electrical grid, the single greatest civilizational advance of the 20th century, with intermittent wind and solar capacity. Has there ever been such an insane, irrational and destructive mass hallucination as so-called renewable energy? This chart I'll put up is the renewable energy hockey stick. Actually, that's not the renewable energy, whoops, we'll get that. That's the renewable energy hockey stick chart. So what you see there is up to around 200 watts along the bottom axis. You'll see that's solar PV and wind capacity in watts. So up to about 200 watts of installed wind and solar per capita. The blade of the hockey stick is flat at around 15 euro cents per kilowatt hour. Put more wind and solar on the grid above that level and prices start to rise, topping out at over 26 euro cents per kilowatt hour in Germany and over 29 euro cents in Germany. Sorry, the first one was in Denmark. By comparison, Americans on average paid around 7.5 euro cents, or just over 9 US cents per kilowatt hour, between 1/4 and 1/3 what Danes and Germans paid in 2012. It's not just that wind and solar capacity are expensive. Denmark has a lot of wind capacity, and Germany has the most solar PV in the world. It's that intermittent capacity destroys the value of electricity for all generators. Based on detailed modelling of the Northwest European market, energy analyst Laren Hurt reckons that at 30% penetration, the curse of intermittency means the value of electricity from wind is worth only 1/2 of that if wind was stable and non-intermittent. At this penetration, the wholesale price of electricity, one received by gas and coal-fired capacity as well, falls to 0 for 1,000 hours a year. And wind gets the subsidy, whereas coal, gas and nuclear that keep the lights on whatever the weather do not. For cloudy northwest Europe, solar's value destruction is even worse. Its value halves before it reaches 15% market share. And here's the thing. As the next chart shows, as Germany dramatically ramped up its wind and solar capacity, its CO2 emissions actually rose. Between 1999 and 2012, wind and solar capacity rose nearly 13-fold, while power station emissions rose 5%. The big fall in German power station emissions happened as a result of German unification, when many of East Germany's oldest and most polluting power stations were closed and most of its heavy industry from the communist era disappeared. And as I like to point out, if there were any gratitude in this world, Angela Merkel and the Germans should be sending NATO a thank you letter together with a very large cheque for those emissions cuts. But that is the preeminent policy response of having lots of wind and solar, which actually doesn't cut CO2 emissions, is not incidental to the global warming project. In the mind of green activist Bill McKimmon, climate denial is now twinned with something what he calls as ugly and insidious, renewable denial. In saying this, McKibbon gives the game away. For global warming is the most powerful lever in the armoury of a pre-existing radical green ideology to effect a deep transformation of society. As Germany shows, with its closure of its zero CO2 emitting nuclear power stations and its ban on fracking, global warming is a pretext for the switch to renewables. It is not the underlying aim. To explain what this is really about, I'd like to take you to a climate conference held in Essen, Germany in June 2009. Climate change as cultural change. The aim of the conference was to chart the third of humanity's greatest revolutions, but unlike the Neolithic and industrial revolutions that preceded them, this one would be centrally planned and directed. Germany's top climate ideologues were at that conference, including Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, a science advisor to Angela Merkel, to the president of the European Commission, who later would appear in the Vatican press conference at the launch of the papal encyclical Laudato Si. A member of the Club of Rome, Schellnhuber wants the 2 degrees Celsius limit above pre-industrial temperatures written into international law, a cadre of elite scientists to be embedded in the legislative process, and a new constitutional settlement would enable judges to overturn the will of the majority, something that one of Schellnhuber's very rare German critics called the legitimization of a soft dictatorship. Long-standing members of the German Communist Party were also at the Essen conference, calling for a cultural revolution to transform capitalism. So was the head of the Brookings Institution. William Antholis heaped praise on Europeans who viewed national sovereignty as a problem, and for the European Union in developing a model for global governance. John Podesta, the man who had been Bill Clinton's last chief of staff and had just headed President Obama's transition team, assured the conference that President Obama saw climate change as the greatest challenge of the age. Quote, "We need a profound change in our culture and ethics." Now, this is the key point to understand. The age of global warming wasn't meant to be the age of wind and solar. At the first big climate conference in Toronto in 1988, wind and solar weren't even mentioned in the final conference document. The nuclear solution is especially true of the country that did more than any other to put global warming on the international agenda. So I'd like to take a few minutes of your time to tell you about Green Tyranny, the book that Rob kindly mentioned. It tells a story of 2 countries. Sweden started the war on coal in the late 1960s. Sweden didn't have any coal itself, but the ruling Social Democrats decided to embark on the world's largest civil nuclear program per capita. But nuclear power wasn't at all popular, so they decided to frighten Swedes by claiming the alternative to nuclear was far worse. If you don't have nuclear, Sweden's forests will die and its lakes will fill up with sulfuric acid, the acid rain scare. And next came global warming. In 1974, when Al Gore was still at law school, the Swedish Prime Minister was saying that climate change would be the big issue at the end of the 20th century. If nuclear had been the answer, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. The economics of nuclear might be less attractive than coal and gas, but is safe, reliable, and can generate prodigious amounts of on-demand power. But for the second of the 2 countries, nuclear power is verboten. In no country is nuclear power as unpopular as in Germany. And in no other country is there such a deep cultural obsession with wind and solar. It happens to be a historical fact that the Nazis were the first political party anywhere in the world to champion wind power, which they did in the 1933 Reichstag elections. And there on the left, you can see the plans for a Nazi wind tower. Just weeks after invading the Soviet Union, Hitler was telling his dinner companions that wind power was the future. In the first decades of the Second World War, West Germany was a model Western democracy. But that changed with the student riots of the 60s and 70s. Some of those student radicals turned to terrorists. Others became leaders of the Green Party, which was formed in 1980. And their movement was turbocharged by the campaign to prevent NATO deployment of nuclear missiles to counter Soviet SS-20s. In 1998, the first Red-Green coalition was being formed in Berlin. The people who'd been on the wrong side of the Cold War turned out to be the winners in the post-Cold War era. Where Germany led, the rest of Europe followed. As I put it in the book, the greening of Europe was the price the West paid for winning the Cold War. To conclude, I'd ask you to remember two things. The climate-industrial complex does not occupy the moral high ground. On the contrary. Second, this is about more than energy, important as that is. Ultimately, it's about freedom, and it's about whether America remains true to its founding in creating a form of government dedicated to the maintenance of freedom. Thank you.
Great. So now we'll hear from Lou on the North American petroleum renaissance, how it changes everything, and how sustaining its growth requires the right policies.
Okay, great. I think the slides are coming up. So I might say things. So, we've been around since 1944. We're really in the space of the intersection of public policy and petroleum economics. We've written a little bit on coal. We've written too much about on the renewable fuel standard. And we've had a deep dive into the sort of fundamentals of the North American petroleum renaissance since 2006. We were actually thrown out of DOE in 2007 when we had written an article in World Oil about all the oil in Iraq. But the last paragraph, we said, we have a geologist running around North Dakota, and she says, this could really be big. And we went to DOE to talk to them about this, and they literally threw us out of the building. It was very interesting. Later on, that we actually got some support from the Defense Department. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Once a year, though, I'm going to refer to a lot of the work we do, and if you have our webmaster stays up all night playing Warcraft Next Generation or something, so it doesn't always get posted right away. But you can get it from me. Okay, so I'll make sure you get that. So this is a picture about 10 million years ago. Okay, it was before the Endangered Species Act, so the plankton were allowed to die, and the dinosaurs, which formed a lot of the geologic basis for oil. Now, the interesting thing about this Western Interior Seaway is that where these deposits ended up are here. And what's unique about these? So if you think about traditionally how you looked for oil, is you had to find it in a trap where it migrated from something called source rock, right? But finding it in a trap wasn't always easy. It wasn't that productive. But this is where we find lots of what we call source rock. It's sort of where the origins of oil actually exists before it migrates out. And the big interesting thing people say about the North American petroleum renaissance is we learned how to drill from source rock. But that's not the real interesting story. The interesting story is, through some magic of the way the Union was formed, the source rock ended up largely in areas where there was private property. If the source rock was on public land, you would still be waiting for the first lease sale. So you could get a landman, I've seen this, a landman in West Texas sees something, right? He's sitting next to the geologist, says, that looks like something I saw in Pennsylvania. The crew boss says, you get on a plane this afternoon and talk to that farmer. And so this is completely dynamic. It's not the below ground stuff that's interesting. It's the revolution in above ground. We had private property. You did not have to write a national environmental policy statement to drill an oil well. Very important. Okay, this is gas. As you can see, natural gas has literally boomed without the North American Petroleum Renaissance. Without this access to these source rock, we would not have seen this explosion in natural gas. We've had a big problem in the U.S., by the way. We continue to have a mentality in which we're running out of stuff. It's very hard. You know, a lot of the problems with exporting LNG is that the industrial users in the U.S. have said, look, this is terrible. You're exporting all this gas. Gas prices are going to go up. But that's not what happened to gas prices. They went down, and they continue to go down. The long-run price of gas and oil in the United States is not going to be determined by reserves. We are not reserve limited. It's the cost of manufacturing it. It's the advancement in technology, and that's happening every day. This is a very interesting chart. If you see one of the features of the North American Petroleum Renaissance is that, well, we're running out of gas, you know, the technology can't keep up. If you look at the brown line there, the sort of brown line, and you go from about 2010 to 2014, that is literally the fastest run-up in oil production in the history of the world oil market, right? And it occurs, and it continued to kind of progress somewhat even when the rig count, which is the black line, fell. Now, there's a lot of comments that, well, we're running out of gas. It doesn't have as much productivity as it used to. Here's a series of charts from the Permian Basin. And these little peaks here show you something called IP, initial production, right? And you can see that every year from 2012 to 2017, when you drill a well in the Permian, the initial production, that production you get in the first few months, always got higher. It always was higher. And in fact, the slope is even getting less, right? And, you know, there was a little discussion today that we're going to run out of these wells in 10 years. No, we're not going to run out. We can just drill another well. It's a manufacturing process, right? And the manufacturing process is getting cheaper all the time. Source rock is ubiquitous, okay? And we have lots of source rock in the U.S. By the way, we don't even have the best shale formations in the world. Probably the Bashneft in Russia, the Vaca Muerta in Argentina are superior in many ways. But we have good above-ground rules. And those rules are what's making this perform at such a high level. Okay, now, another issue is what's going on with these long, so if you don't know about as we produce oil, we use longer frac lines. They make a long story short, they take a pipe, take a horizontal distance a long ways, and if you make it longer, people argue, well, you can get more. But people say, is it productive to do that? This chart is based on a forthcoming paper, which actually I have if anyone wants it, on a basis of 1. Okay, so 1 is kind of the base case to look at productivity from longer fracs. And what this shows is that the longer fracs are not only yielding more, but they're yielding more per unit of input. So the productivity of the whole resource base, and Mark's going to talk a little bit about this, is getting better. Now, this chart here shows why we need more pipelines. Now, it might be obvious to you why that's the case by looking at it. If you look at the green, or yellow, I guess, the chartreuse colors in this chart, right? Those are the only oil supplies going into North American processing centers which are coming over the sea, right? So, if you look at Canada in the middle of the country, right, it's all processing North American crude. If you produce more crude anywhere in the northern tier, in North Dakota or Canada, you have to move it to a coastal refining center. You have to do it. And it's an artifact of our historical development because when we produce very little oil, we imported it into the Gulf Coast, we processed it or shipped it all the way up the northern tier. So all the fight over pipelines, Keystone, everything is very misplaced. If you want the North American production platform to prosper, and there's a good reason why it should, right, you need to get the transportation to move the crude from where it's produced to where it needs to be processed. Now, the other interesting thing is, there's a sense in sort of energy security circles and everything that we should worry about imports or that we become independents. But there's a big difference between dependence and vulnerability. The real value of the North American production platform is that it is a secure source, not just for North America, but for the world oil market. It's a stable source of production in the world oil market. It's not subject to terrorism. It's not subject to sort of excessive political interventions. And if you look at this chart here, you can see, yes, U.S. still imports 10 million barrels a day, but our net imports are 4 million barrels a day. And of those net imports, 5.3, 2.4 comes from Canada. It's a very secure and prosperous platform. And what does it look like if we take it as terms of NAFTA? If we take Mexico, the U.S., and Canada as a single production platform, this highly secure platform is a kind of, just an enormous security instrument for the U.S. Actually, our net imports are a little over 4 million barrels. And if you take most of the data, look at most of what's happening in terms of investment and the potential expansion, even in Canada, net imports to the North American platform are going to zero within the next 3 to 4 years. Okay. Now, the other thing is, there was a little discussion about gas exports. We have so much gas, right? We have so much gas that we need to export it. We need to, and it's a huge sort of economic engine for the U.S. We're exporting over 4 billion cubic feet a day to Mexico. We were also involved in a project with our sister think tank in Japan, Institute for Energy Economics in Japan, and we published a big report on the future of Asian LNG, what can be done to open up those markets there, to make them more open and transparent and liquid. Now, that report is on our website, and I recommend any who's interested. It's a very interesting piece of work. So, the prospects for this platform are really sort of tremendous going forward. And for that to take place, we're going to need sort of sound policies. We're not going to have a lot of the things that it had in the past that were unfortunately led to constraints in the ability to expand that. Now, I only have 2 remaining pictures I want to show you. Maybe you're not old enough to know about this man. It's Steve McQueen. If you saw this movie Bullet, okay, he was driving a 1968 Ford Mustang GT. Actually, it's one of the longest chase scenes in American film. It goes about 12 or 13 minutes. And if you listen to the soundtrack, you hear a lot of double clutching. That actually wasn't necessary because he was driving a 4-speed, but it's Hollywood. But, and I was curious about, people, there's a lot of talk about electric cars and all this stuff. But if you looked at criteria pollutants, right, SO2, NOx, SOx, volatile organic compounds, that was a tremendous beast. It was a great muscle car. If you had it, you could get a girlfriend. And it generated about 1 ton of criteria pollutants in 100,000 miles. Do you know what today's Mustang generates? 10 pounds. So the question is, why aren't we done? And the reason we're not done is because people have now decided that we need to sort of go after the automobile for climate reasons. And finally, my last slide is we call this the law of diminishing marginal returns. And one of the problems with the CAFE standards and as they're proposed right now is that we have backloaded all the costs. We've backloaded all the costs. And there's a big fight going on what we should do with the automobile fuel economy standards. And our view is, well, you're not getting much bang for the buck. So you ought to give this a really hard look before you do more for this. But this is a very important fight that's taking place now, because if we go forward with it, you're only going to be able to make the standard by producing more electric cars. And when you do that, you're going to increase the average cost of an automobile by $3,000 to $4,000. Okay, that's it. 30 seconds.
And now Mark's going to address the notion that the adoption of electric cars and improvements in wind and solar technologies will solve all of our energy needs. Mark?
I'll just stay right here.
Okay,
This will be
great.
This will be easier. The slides up. So I'm not going to talk about climate science or, in fact, about energy policy, but about energy technology from a very simple premise. And in my travels and my personal, I guess, anecdotal experience, the thing we all, many of you may experience this, you hear is essentially this thesis among policymakers and you know, cocktail parties, is that the climate science debate seems confusing to people. A lot of people are amenable to the idea, I found, to the idea that there really is a debate. I mean, it's not that hard to get people understand that science could have controversy. But what you end up with is precautionary principle. It's invoked. Well, if it is true, I mean, if it does happen, it's an existential threat. So wouldn't it make sense to have the insurance policy of embracing the magic of what technology is already offering us? And the magic of technology in people's heads is distilled really two domains. That we're going to eliminate the demand for oil largely because of Elon Musk and Tesla. I have impolitely called that the Tesla derangement syndrome in some of my pieces, but it's a firmly held conviction that battery-powered cars will eliminate the need, the demand for oil. So it's happening anyway because of the magic of technology, essentially Silicon Valley kind of mindset. And the other one, of course, is the wind and solar, not to dispute, but actually to complement Rupert's view that this is the age of wind and solar. People really do believe that wind and solar are the same technological pattern as computers, that this is inevitable. They're going to get a lot cheaper, a lot faster, and therefore, why not provide a slight push, a little acceleration through incentives. Let me just show you 4 graphs to illustrate why these two notions that technology offers a cheap insurance policy that's happening anyway is simply not only not true, but not possible. Let's start with peak oil demand from electric cars. This is very simple. This is a simplification of the International Energy Agency's new report issued in June this year on the future for electric transportation globally. What I've done is just taken their graph for the forecast, the 4 scenarios. The red line obviously is their most optimistic scenario for the number of EVs in the world, 15 to 20 years out. And the real operating question one should ask is if the optimistic forecast happened, how much demand destruction occurs in global oil markets? That's what you would want to know. Not whether it will happen, but if it were to happen. And not whether or not electric cars become cheaper or not. Just assume they do become cheaper or they get subsidized into cheapness somehow. So the most optimistic forecasts have the world going from today's world of 2 million EVs on the road. And 2 million is a bigger number than we've ever had. And it will become 200 million EVs in 15 years. 150 million EVs in just a decade. This is a pretty big growth rate for an industrial infrastructure. I think there will be a challenge to it. I'll address it in a minute, but assume it does happen. What does that mean for oil markets? This is just an arithmetical calculation. It's not complicated. It doesn't require a computer model. We know that the world will have, in 20 years, about 2 billion cars. It has about 1 billion today. 200 million out of the 1.5 billion in 15 years is 15%. So 15% of the world's cars are now using no oil. Assume they use no natural gas either, that they're all powered through wind and solar. What does that do to world oil consumption? Well, light vehicles consume about half of the world's oil, roughly speaking. So 15% of the world's transportation means 7% of the world's oil market is taken away if the most optimistic scenario happens. Put another way, we should, in a sense, hope the most optimistic scenario happens. Because world demand for oil is continuing to grow. It's growing at a pace. In fact, despite my bullishness on the physical resources, it will be an interesting challenge to meet global demand for oil that will rise by an amount equal to adding a United States worth of demand over the next 20 years. So we should actually hope Elon Musk and the EV followers succeed and take 7% out of world demand. But that 7% is not existential. It doesn't eliminate demand for oil. Even doubling that, even doubling the most optimistic scenario, doesn't take away world demand for oil in the next 15 to 20 years. And that time frame is an infinite amount of time for policymakers. It's far beyond the horizons that governments and politicians plan. It'll also, though, present, if it were to happen, a very interesting demand for other resources. I mean, every electric car has a battery in it. Batteries require materials, just like oil requires materials. The reason there's a picture of a mining truck here is because it's an easy calculation to do. The average energy content of a barrel of oil is contained in 300 pounds of oil. To store 300 pounds of oil's worth of energy in batteries, you need 20,000 pounds of Tesla batteries. 20,000 pounds. To produce the 20,000 pounds of batteries, you need to mine and move something on the order of 500,000 pounds of stuff from the earth. So over the life of a car, say 10 years, you'll need to use, with today's cars, about 3,000 pounds of oil and 500,000 pounds of other stuff to make the batteries. This, in environmental terms, is not a good trade, because digging stuff out of the earth is where environmental impacts happen. The world's consumption of nickel, cobalt, manganese, lithium, all these things increase by astonishing amounts in an all-EV world, and they're all imported because we don't like mining in America anymore. So we will see a dependence, instead of on Saudi Arabia, it'll be on China, where 90% of the world's cobalt's refined, Bolivia, Ecuador, some Australia, Russia. Those nations will be very happy. But when you say that battery-powered cars won't have a material impact on world oil demand, the response I always get is, well, but batteries will get better. And you notice I assumed batteries would get better in my calculus. I'm assuming batteries in effect are free. And I'm assuming the world's mining infrastructure will increase by tenfold to meet batteries to get to those scenarios. But still you get a response, well, batteries will get better, because in people's heads that somehow is technology invokes some kind of magic response in markets. Batteries will get better. So this graph shows you where batteries are today by the metric that matters for untethered vehicles. That's not trains or things that have tethered cords behind them. But the energy density of fuels matters. You can measure this in cars and airplanes by the August metric. How many miles can you go per pound of fuel? The red line is how many miles you can go per pound of oil. The blue line is how many miles you go per pound of battery. It doesn't matter what the battery chemistry is. They're all within roughly this range. And what I've shown you is a dislocation occurring 2 years out where the energy density of batteries magically doubles. And what that gets you for a magic doubling, which is not impossible, by the way, in physics, you can double batteries' energy efficiencies. The difficulty is just in deploying an infrastructure and a reliable battery at twice the energy density we have today. That will happen. Internal combustion engines are getting better. Technology gets better. Batteries are getting better. The delta is huge. In fact, the spread is about 5,000% between the best battery chemistry and oil. This is a spread that cannot be solved by subsidies, and it cannot be solved by magic. This is a result of the atoms that we have available on the periodic table in the universe that we live in. This spread means, well, you could change universes. There are TV series on this, so maybe we can go to a stranger universe. That picture, by the way, is the new Mercedes-Benz C-Class, which has an engine, a four-cylinder engine. It has more horsepower than Steve McQueen's Mustang GT, and gets 40 miles per gallon on the highway. And in my opinion, drives much nicer than the Tesla, but I like Teslas okay. All right, peak oil supply has gone. We now have instead this idea of peak demand, which I hope I've dispelled you the sense that it's possible. But in the oil and in the energy demand side, the conviction that wind and solar are somehow magically following a revolutionary supply curve is, of course, a result of the constant repetition of the word, the solar and wind revolution. Well, we have had a solar and wind revolution. It did occur in history, and we spent a lot of money to get there. This is a graph of the total additional new energy supplied to the United States. This is EIA data. Over the last decade, the combined additional amount of energy in barrels of oil equivalent from oil and gas, and the combined additional amount of energy supplied to America from wind and solar. The green line is wind and solar. The blue line is oil and gas. In the last decade, wind and solar, with $150 billion of subsidies, have grown dramatically from a trivial base to a slightly larger than trivial base. But the percentage growth rate is enormous, because when you go from a number that's near zero, you can get very high growth rates. But the absolute increase in energy supply from wind and solar is 2,000% less than, 2,000% less than the additional energy supplied to America from unsubsidized oil and gas. That's history. Going forward, and by the way, history, if you wanted a definition of the word revolution, we would assume that history constitutes an actual revolution. As Lou pointed out, this increase in oil and gas supply combined is the largest increase in energy supply to the world in human history. Full stop. Nothing else has ever occurred this fast, this big, at any time in human history. What happens in the future? This is the EIA forecast. The dotted line is their optimistic forecast. The solid blue line is their baseline forecast for oil and gas in America. The green line is their optimistic forecast for wind and solar. Their optimistic forecasts assume the subsidies continue, so another $200 to $300 billion in subsidies. over the forecast period, and no subsidies for oil and gas. I think their optimistic line is the baseline for oil and gas, in my view, but let's assume that they're right about their baseline, the blue line. That means over the next 15 years, oil and gas in America will add 1,000% more new energy to the American supply system than wind and solar combined. That's a revolution. Obviously, the wind and solar don't constitute a revolution in any meaningful way. There is no mechanism here through subsidies to make this go faster because there's nothing in the physics that lets it go faster. This will be my last slide for you. This is, having shown you the previous graph and these growth rates, the invocation again is the same thing, but the technology will get better. Wind and solar will get better because just like computers got better, and the geniuses in Silicon Valley who spend money in venture funds to fund green tech will make it better. The magic of Silicon Valley will somehow be like a penumbra over top of wind and solar. So here's where you have to sort of just do two simple facts that are a useful starting point. Start with the graph on your left, and this is where we are today, not where we're going to go in the future. If you had $1 million of capital to spend on producing energy, how much energy would I get from my $1 million of investment over the 30-year operations of that piece of hardware that I've spent my money on? It's a useful thing to know. If I took the best available shale rig and put $1 million into it, and if I count the conversion efficiency, so Rupert, you and I discussed this, what I get over the 30-year life of the shale or oil rig is about 400,000 barrels of oil, a real oil equivalent gas for the $1 million. If I put $1 million into a wind turbine, over the life of the 30-year life of the wind turbine, I get around 100,000 barrels of oil equivalent of energy. If I do it for a solar array, for the very best array you can get today, for the same $1 million, I get about 35,000 barrels of oil equivalent of energy. This graph explains why the two bars that are smaller require subsidies and why there's $500 billion of capital, free market investment going into the shale fields of America each year, because this is a lot of return on your investment. But it will get better. Okay, this is the response. So Lou showed you graphs of the production and productivity curves of shale rigs. Shale rigs have been getting better at 20% a year for the last 6 years. So those of you who had an investment, if I told you you could have 20% a year going forward, this is the doubling of your money every 3 years, you'd be a happy camper. That's the rate of improvement in shale rigs today. Eventually that will slow down. All things hit asymptotes in the world we live in. The universe requires asymptotes, full stop, biological systems and physical systems. But the shale asymptote hasn't been hit yet. We know it will be hit. I have my own guess that it will be hit, but we're not there yet. We're on the early days. As I think Bud Brigham may have said, we're in the third inning of a full game, if you like, of baseball with the shale business. Solar and wind have hit their asymptotes. The graph you see on your right, I believe it, yeah, it's on your right. This is NREL data. National Renewable Energy Labs is the gold standard for doing both measurements of efficiency and forecasts on the rate of improvements of efficiencies for solar and wind turbines. And what you see here, and these are both normalized to the efficiency. By efficiency, I mean how much energy you get per dollar spent on a piece of equipment, per solar cell, per wind turbine. You can see that we've had this astounding decrease in cost, astounding improvement in efficacy and efficiency from 1980 to about 2000. Tenfold. Big improvement, big change. And this is what's fueled the revolution along with the subsidies. You wouldn't be able to subsidize them at the 1980 levels of capital efficiency. But what you see going forward is the classic asymptotic curve, law of diminishing returns. And what NREL is saying is that we're now on the kind of diminishing returns of improvements in efficiency, roughly the same as we see in all technical systems and economic systems and machines. You can get a few percent a year. You'll keep getting a little more efficient, but not. The tenfold gains are all now behind us. They're all in history. The reason that we know they're firmly in history is just physics. It's nothing to do with the lack of appetite or investment. It doesn't require a moonshot or an Apollo program to get the tenfold again. We know you can't get it again because we're near physics limits for the two key technologies. By that, what I mean is very simple. A solar array cannot produce more energy than the electrons you can convert from photons where we are in the solar system. The only way you can get more photons to the solar array is to move the Earth closer to the sun. This is a difficult challenge. It's possible in Star Trek, but perhaps, maybe if we warm the Earth up enough, it'll move closer. So we know that the Shockley limit for silicon photocells is somewhere in the low 30% range, 33%. The very best solar cells are now 29, 30%, which means you can go better. But you're not going to go from 3% to 30% again. We've already done that. You can't go from 30% to 90% because the physics doesn't permit it. You can make them a little cheaper by going to volume, but you don't get the 10-bang change. We've hit the Shockley limit. Wind turbines have the same issue. Wind blades move because the wind moves by the blade. Sounds tautologically obvious. If I extract all the energy from the wind stops, the blade stops. So this is called the Betz limit. The Betz limit tells you how much energy you can extract from moving air. It's about 44, 45%. Wind turbines today run close to 39%. So you can do a little better, but the reason you see asymptotes in these curves is because we have made them so efficient that we're close to the physics limits. We are not at physics limits for shale wells because we know that roughly 95% of the resource is left in the ground. We will get close to physics limits, I think, in the next decade. We're not there yet. We're about a 10x away from the physics limits in shale. So the shale is essentially in 1980. It's going to drop, I think, tenfold over the next 10 to 20 years. The economic issues, are we at economic limits? All these domains are using as inputs commodities that are already commodities that are produced in high volume. We can't reduce the cost of batteries by making more batteries. We're already using materials that are in commodity level production. None of this says that solar is not going to grow. We're going to have lots more solar panels in the world, lots more electric cars, but they will not constitute a transformational revolution. There is no insurance policy on counting on something that can't break physics laws.
Thank you, Mark. So Kevin will wrap up with a cost-benefit analysis of ending the war on fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you to the Texas Public Policy Foundation for putting this together. My name is Kevin Diarana. I'm a senior statistician and research programmer here at the Heritage Foundation, and I am going to talk about the peace dividend, the benefits of ending the war on fossil fuels. So let me just start out by talking about this thing. Oh, here we go. The slide's not moving. Oh, here we go. So in June of this year, President Trump gave a nice speech in Los Angeles where he really started to speak volumes about the potential of American energy. And after the speech, he tweeted, "Our new American energy policy will unlock millions of jobs and trillions of wealth. We are on the cusp of a true energy revolution." Now, over the course of the campaign trail, he suggested that ending the Obama Climate Action Plan would save $30 billion in 7 years, and ending the Paris Agreement would save $100 billion in 8 years. So the question I have, and I want us to keep this in mind as the talk goes on, was President Trump right? So before we go there, let's first talk about energy in and of itself. Energy is literally the key building block of civilization. From lighting up your homes, to enabling you to drive your cars, to enabling this very conference to operate, energy is literally the basis of anything and everything we do. And unfortunately, many people take it for granted. So, speaking of energy, what did we hear about it during the Obama years? We heard that fossil fuels are evil. And they are evil because they emit carbon dioxide, which contributes significantly to anthropogenic global warming. So, as a result, there are a number of policy suggestions that were proposed. Firstly, there was cap and trade, that President Obama couldn't even get through his filibuster-proof Senate. Then there was a clean power plan where there were EPA directives to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. And then subsequently there was the Paris Agreement, which was an agreement amongst countries to curb greenhouse emissions because the threat of catastrophic global warming is so grave, we must do something to stop it. So, whenever you make such a change to such a fundamental building block of society, it is important to quantify the economic impact. Now, here at the Heritage Foundation, we have the Heritage Energy Model, which is a derivative of the Department of Energy's National Energy Modeling System that enables us to quantify the economic impact of various energy policies. So, regarding the Clean Power Plan, what is the economic impact? Well, we use the Heritage Energy Model to look at this question, and we noticed that by 2035, the Clean Power Plan would result in an average employment shortfall of over 80,000 lost jobs, a loss of income of more than $10,000 for a family of 4, an up to 5% increase in household electricity expenditures, and an aggregate $1 trillion loss in GDP. We also used at Heritage the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change to quantify the economic impact, the climate impact, and we noticed that there would be less than a 0.2 degrees Celsius degree temperature mitigation and less than 2 centimeters of sea level rise reduction. Now, how about the Paris Agreement? Well, we also quantified that. And we noticed that as a result of the carbon capture regulations associated with the Paris Agreement, the country would see an average employment shortfall of over 600,000 lost jobs, a loss of income of more than $20,000 for a family of 4, an up to 20% increase in household electricity expenditures, and now an aggregate $2.5 trillion loss in GDP. Again, for a negligible change in global temperatures. So, what is all this poorly designed policy premised under? The answer is a very simple question. The so-called social cost of carbon, which was basically the left's device as a tool for regulatory policy. What is it? It is a construct based on research in climate economics, and it was proposed as a basis for regulatory policy by the Obama administration's interagency working group. And in a nutshell, it is defined as the economic damages per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions. And the question is, okay, so how do you actually estimate it? Well, the general question becomes, in estimating the SEC, what is the long-term economic impact of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon? And the federal government had 3 main statistical models for getting at this question: the DICE model, the FUN model, and the PAGE model. And each of these models represented a series of equations modeling economic growth and climate response, and they're estimated by what statisticians refer to as Monte Carlo analysis. The idea is that various components of the models are random, so therefore they are repeatedly estimated, and then distributional properties of the social cost of carbon can be computed. So now here's the thing. As with any statistical model, these models are grounded by assumptions. In particular, a few main assumptions here were the specification of a discount rate, the specification of a time horizon, and the specification of what we call an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution. So firstly, the specification of a discount rate. So supposing the social cost of carbon is legitimate, what would be the rate of return on an investment associated with averting these damages from occurring? So the discount rate enables you to quantify this phenomenon. Now, we noticed that the Obama administration had stealthily ignored advice about the discount rate that was specified by the Office of Management and Budget. In particular, they ignored a 7% discount rate. When I testified about this on the Hill, I gave my own theories as to why they ignored the 7% discount rate. But regardless, we ran at Heritage a 7% discount rate for them. Regarding an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution. So, research indicates that the Earth's temperature would warm in response to carbon dioxide emissions. The question is, how much? Well, ECS distributions enable you to probabilistically quantify this phenomenon. And we noticed with the ECS distributions that were being used by the Obama administration, they overstated the probability of high-end global warming. Now, lastly, there was a specification of a time horizon. I was alluding to the fact earlier that economic damages are summed across a particular time horizon. The question is, what is this time horizon? Well, foolishly, these models try to make projections 300 years into the future. Now, let me just ask by a show of hands, how many of you have a smartphone? Okay. Almost everybody in this room. Well, many things that are commonplace today, the smartphone, the tablet, GPS technology, these things would have been mere science fiction just a couple decades ago. Today, they are very commonplace. And similarly, we have no idea what the economy will look like decades, let alone centuries into the future. So we noticed that by running these models in-house and making very, very reasonable changes to these assumptions, the SEC can drop by 40 to 200%, and it can even be negative at times under very reasonable assumptions. And the policy implication there would be that you shouldn't be taxing carbon dioxide emissions, but that you should be subsidizing it instead. So with these results all over the map, these models can readily be manipulated by policymakers to get pretty much whatever answer that they want. So how did the American people respond to all this? Well, they responded with this: the election of President Donald Trump in November 2016, who was elected to knock down doors in Washington. So now let's think about some common sense policy. What if we actually ended the war on fossil fuels? Now, it's long been established, my friends talked about this earlier today, that America has a vast energy abundance. And the models tell us that carbon dioxide emissions in very reasonable quantities isn't necessarily a bad thing. And with the SEC potentially being negative under very reasonable assumptions, it might actually be a good thing. So firstly, how much oil do we have here in the States? Well, the Institute for Energy Research, in their North American Energy Inventory, forecasted that we have over 1.3 trillion barrels of recoverable oil and over 2 quadrillion cubic feet of natural gas. And this chart is from that report, where the green areas are oil production and the red areas are gas production. So what would be the impact of actually unlocking this vast supply? Well, we also used the Heritage Energy model to get at this question, and we noticed that by taking advantage of much of these resources, by 2035, we'd see an average employment gain of nearly 700,000 jobs, an increase in over $40,000 of personal income for a family of 4, an up to 10% reduction in household electricity expenditures, and an aggregate $3.7 trillion increase in GDP. And again, negligible changes in the climate and sea level. So we see significant economic gains and little climate change whatsoever. So who benefits from all this? Well, firstly, in the short term, directly associated with the extraction, there are tremendous job opportunities for engineers, mathematicians, data scientists. The local stores, restaurants, motels, hotels, and so forth all get business. But in the long run, the fundamental building block of society becomes less expensive. Businesses find it easier to hire. People find it easier to get jobs. Household electricity expenditures, as our simulations indicated, decline. So, in a nutshell, unlocking the supply leads to more jobs, more income, and a much healthier economy. So what are the policy implications here? Well, firstly, it's imperative that we open up access, and we started to see some of this in President Trump's executive orders, open access to federal waters and lands. We should also allow states to regulate fracking and enable states to manage energy development. Local people working in conjunction with state and local officials have a much better sense of their environment than some Washington bureaucrat that might be thousands of miles away. So now going back to the original question, was President Trump right? Would ending the Climate Action Plan save $30 billion over 7 years? Well, according to our Heritage Energy model simulations, it would actually save $290 billion over that time. How about ending the Obama-era spending on global warming? Would that really save $100 billion in 8 years? According to our simulations, it would actually save $1.3 trillion. So vast underestimates. So in a nutshell, when you really compare taking advantage of these resources to the left's top-down regulatory approach, over just the next 8 years, we would see an increase in over 900,000 more jobs, and added $1.9 trillion of increased GDP to the economy, marked reductions in electricity prices, and a negligible change on climate and sea levels. So what is the potential of American energy? Well, as I've talked about here, the sky is literally the limit, and we now have the opportunity of a lifetime to give the best gift possible to our children and grandchildren by taking advantage of our vast resources to provide the cheapest and most economical energy on the planet. And this is why it is absolutely imperative that we end the war on fossil fuels. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, we've got a little bit of time here, and I'll kind of take moderator's prerogative and start with the question. One kind of general one, Mark, you so deftly addressed the maybe over-reliance or kind of more of a faith in dramatic technological improvements in wind and solar and what that could deliver. It also seems to me sometimes when you're in discussions about energy, some people, the first place they go is to talk about energy conservation or efficiency, which we all recognize are valuable things, but it's almost as if that's the foundation for them as a policy. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how some fundamentally flawed concepts are embedded in our discussions and thought about energy.
Well, I mean, everyone in this room knows that there's a efficiency in conservation taken in the right context, not wasting things stupidly. It's like, mother and apple pie. I mean, you can't. No one politically opposes supporting efficiency and sensible conservation. There are obvious two problems with the embrace of that as a solution. It's the idea that efficiency or conservation, and Amory Lovins, of course, coined the phrase negawatts, is a form of energy, is sort of nonsensical. You can't power a car with an empty gas tank. It doesn't matter how efficient it is, it needs gasoline, so it's self-evident. The problem is conservation is behavioral, so that's a behavioral choice. People decide whether or not the money spent on what they're doing is worth it to them to do something else. So that's a difficult area we found historically to invade markets in, and doesn't solve any problems because the world is energy starved, as our friend CEO Murray Energy has pointed out. The world is in energy poverty. We have 5 billion people in the world who have nothing. If only 15% of them rise to the level of energy consumption of the ascetic Europeans, we double world energy consumption. So there's a lot of demand in the world, not conservation. Efficiency is a more interesting one. Efficiency increases demand, doesn't decrease demand. So the category error that's treated is that when someone said we use too much energy to do X or Y, we should make it more efficient. Except in closed systems with no growth and no activity, efficiency, that's the only time efficiency reduces consumption. So I'll give one example. I mean, the data center that we're operating today at 1980 efficiency of computing, which is the most dramatic example of energy efficiency improvements. A single data center would consume as much energy as the city of Manhattan. And we have thousands of data centers in the United States and tens of thousands in the world, precisely because we made it more efficient. If it hadn't been more efficient, there'd be none. The energy consumption of global data systems now is double the energy consumption of Japan for all purposes. That new form of energy demand would never have occurred but for the fact of a radical improvement in the efficiency of computing.
Let me, Kevin, you mentioned social cost of carbon models.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could maybe address a little bit what kind of role you think this modeling should have in our policy making.
Okay, well, thanks, Rob. So I alluded to this a little bit in the talk. I've given some more extensive talks on this. You can find them on YouTube if you're interested. But the issue is that these models can be readily manipulated by policymakers because they are so sensitive to very reasonable changes in assumptions. I was asked on the Hill, for example, why did the government ignore the 7% discount rate? The reason is very, very simple. You get a negative SCC under a 7% discount rate, even if you use outdated assumptions regarding climate sensitivity. And because these results can be literally all over the map, a policymaker can use them to justify his regulatory agenda. This is why they have absolutely no place in regulatory policy right now.
Okay. Now, I have plenty of questions, but I'd like to take someone else. Can you, sir? Mike's coming to you. Can you identify yourself?
Matt Michaels from Cato. Kevin, I think you have a mistake in one of your slides. I think the temperature mitigation of the clean power plan is
okay.
0.02 degrees C, not 0.2.
No, okay. So no, that's a good question, Pat. So when we did those magic model simulations, what we did was we didn't even just run the simulation of mitigating carbon dioxide emissions from the United States. We eliminated carbon dioxide emissions from the United States and all industrialized countries completely in order to get an upper bound on what this temperature mitigation would be. If you eliminate all carbon dioxide emissions from all industrialized countries and you assume a climate sensitivity that is probably too large, you get around a 0.2 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation. Yes, under what the Clean Power Plan suggests, you would probably have even less than that. But this is an upper bound. That's why the slide said less than 0.2 degrees Celsius temperature mitigation. So,
You're using a really high sensitivity.
yeah, 4.5 degrees. This is even higher than the Obama administration suggested. Excuse me?
You're using RCP 8.5.
I used A1B.
We're in the weeds, Pat. We're in
So,
the weeds.
for example, so if you look at the simulations regarding the fracking simulation where you take advantage of the oil and gas supply, There we actually looked at the delta regarding carbon dioxide emissions increases from the NEMS model, and there the impact was 0.003 degrees Celsius, which is along the lines of what you're suggesting.
I think the conclusion we should draw is that it's obvious we should be subsidizing hydrocarbon consumption and emissions.
Especially with the SEC being negative.
That's what I'm saying.
I think we had another question over here, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Max Pajor. I work for the Energy Policy Research Foundation. I do anything that Lou tells me. So, essentially I don't have any comments. I'm sorry, I don't have any questions, but I have comments pertinent to Lou, Mark, and Kevin's presentation. First, to Mark Mills's point and to Lou's, the asymptotic curves in your presentations. Just Lou emphasized that to get to this efficiency, you would need more electric vehicles. Mark emphasized the point that we've extracted all the efficiency. I think one of the points I'd like to make here is just what's the cost? So in a smartphone, you have a few grams of lithium. In Lou's laptop here, you have several ounces of lithium. In a Nissan Leaf, you have 44 pounds. In a Tesla, you have 122. So that's the magnitude that you're faced with as far as if you really want to get to 300,000 vehicles or whatever the number is that you were talking about. And as far as Kevin's point about IAMs, Robert Pindyck is an MIT professor. He wrote, he's not of the political temperament that he would show up at a heritage presentation, sort of like, I'm an alien here also. But he wrote a really good review of IAMs. What do they tell us and how useful are they? And he went through, there's a Yale economist by Bill Nordhaus, who's taken over Paul Samuelson's franchise. And he reviewed Stern, who are big people in the discussion of IAMs. And he looked at their models, and he said, you know, we know that there's a public cost, that there's the cost of carbon, but these models are absolutely worthless as far as telling us what to do. So anyway, I'd heartily recommend that you read Robert Pindyck's paper and include it in your presentation.
Maybe I could comment.
Please.
So we have we do, you know, as I said, we've written a lot on renewable fuel standard, and we've worked a lot on this, a lot of issues in this area. So we sort of operate on all models are wrong, a few are useful. Okay, so we try to start out with a basic cost-based calculation, an engineer. So once we know what something costs, at least we have a kind of reference to compare things to. And one thing I'd like to point out on this, a common thing I hear, particularly on the Hills, look, you don't understand, solar and wind is now competitive with oil and gas and coal. I said, look, this is absolute nonsense on the face of it. Here's why I know. U.S. and Canada, in the last 10 years, the governments, I'm just talking about the governments of the U.S. and Canada, in the collection of rents, royalties, and bonus bids. Okay, I'm not talking about payments through the tax system corpus. I'm just saying the economic rent from the leasing of oil and gas resources exceeds $100 billion over the last decade, the two countries together. Nobody is going to hold an auction for the rights to place a windmill in the Atlantic Ocean and get any money for it. And that kind of sort of valuation is kind of overwhelming, right? There's no economic rent in wind and solar. They eat money. Oil and gas still generates hard cash to the Treasury.
Let me also chime in on that. So you made a very interesting statement that, which is, I think you were paraphrasing what Robert Pindyck said, it's hard to price the cost of carbon. But it's interesting that you mentioned the word cost, because of the three models, only one of them actually also includes benefits. The other two only a priori include costs. So the fund model actually includes benefits from, say, fertilization, agricultural yields, and so forth. So I think the correct version of that statement would be, it's difficult to price the costs and benefits of carbon dioxide. Or,
It helps us think about
yeah.
it, but it doesn't give us the useful.
No, which is why, yeah, the models, my colleague said, they shouldn't be called IAMs. They should be called GIGOs, garbage in, garbage out.
I I think we have time for maybe just one more. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. Darren Nelson from Liberty Works. In the second last presentation, that cost curve of solar and wind, can you expand a bit on that? Because that doesn't look right. That's probably a subsidized price, I imagine, or possibly an engineering efficiency concept. It doesn't look like economic efficiency because history and theory tells us in economics that heavily subsidized and heavily regulated industries do not make those sorts of efficiency gains over time.
Those are engineering, economic, unsubsidized costs. The subsidies go into whether the stuff gets deployed. So the native capital cost to build a PV cell is a well-known number, and conversion efficiencies are well-known. That's just the map of those two things for wind turbines and PV arrays. All engineered systems follow those curves. Whether they are deployed that way, and you can distort curve shapes through subsidies. Those are the engineering economics. Those are at NREL data. They're easy to find at NREL's website. They publish every other year history and forecasts of both wind and solar capital efficiencies. Capital meaning the CapEx today and the conversion efficiencies. The non-subsidized CapEx, just the naked economic engineering cost.
Okay. Well, with that, will you join me in thanking our panelists?
Okay, Mark, it's always great. Are you going to dinner?
And now we'll hear from Becky Norton Dunlop and Brooke Rollins before dismissing to the reception and dinner.
So did you
Thanks, Rob. Okay, let's thank our panelists once again, and I'm going to make a few remarks here and get everybody off to dinner. I think we've already sent Brooke on to be the advanced team for dinner. Well, wow, hasn't this been a fabulous day? I mean, wow, really. Just to recap here, let me just remind you of what we've heard today. We started off with an appointee of the new president of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump, and his guy running the EPA, interviewed by Brooke, Scott Pruitt. Home run, right? That was terrific. Of course, sorry, Brooke, I didn't see you there. Brooke's still here. She did a great interview. Doesn't she do a great interview? Yeah. She's terrific. And then, of course, you got a little primer from me on principles. Don't forget principles. And then we heard Mike Lee, what a fabulous lecture. I asked him if we could publish it as a heritage lecture. Congressman Smith from Texas, boy, will we miss him. Hopefully Texas is going to send us a good replacement. Senator Jim Inhofe, what a champion for liberty and for us in this room, good science. Alex Epstein, I don't know how many of you had heard him before, a young up-and-comer warrior. And then 3 all-star panels this afternoon. I mean, boy, I could listen to each of these panelists just all day. It was just so good. We had the science of energy opportunities with some of our great scientists, entrepreneurs who are developing energy resources and can tell us what government is doing to stop them and slow them down and what needs to be fixed. And then the economics of energy, our last panel here, opposition, opportunities, development, and use. And, you know, it's interesting. I think we ended our presentations with the youngest person on our program, which gives me great hope for the future. When you have a smart young guy like this who's thought about these things and makes these presentations, we ought to send him over to report to the tax committees. They wouldn't be quibbling so much about the way to close the deficit. Anyhow, it's been just a great program. Brooke, thank you and your team at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for once again energizing us with this conference. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues at Heritage who have been a great help. But most of all, we want to thank you. I mean, you know, all of this good information does no good if it stays in a lecture room like this. It's up to us, it's up to you to take this information and to spread it out to all of your, the people that you influence, the people who turn to you for good information and good opportunities to know how to deal with these challenges for the future. So we've had a great day today, but it's not over yet. Brooke is hosting us at dinner, and we're going to hear about opportunities for the future for American energy across the ponds, so to speak. So I think we've got a bus downstairs waiting. Brooke will be over there to greet us and welcome us to the dinner, and we've got the Polish ambassador to talk a little bit about what it looks like from over there and what our opportunities are together for people, for liberty, and for energy. So thank you very much. Let's get on to the buses.